February 2023 was to see the 40th anniversary of Avro Vulcan XM 594's arrival at Newark Air Museum. And to mark the occasion, a special weekend was held, which included talks like the one we're about to listen to now by ex-Vulcan pilot.
I was a co-pilot in 1962 on 83 Squadron at RAF Scampton, just north of Lincoln. And then I went on to get a captaincy on 617 Squadron, after which I became a flying instructor on 230 OCUs, which was then at RAF Finningley, now called, would you believe, if it's still in existence, Robin Hood International. From there, well, during my stint as an instructor, it was rather amusing. There were 7 or 8 of us, and one morning we were all lined up, and we were asked whether we would like to fly to teach VIPs. VIPs were group captains, air commodores, air vice marshals. Anyway, they were all lined up. They all said no. It was at the end. Good old military. I was volunteered. It turned out actually quite well, because one of my very best students was an air commodore, and who ended up being my boss at one time or another after that. And I also taught Prince Charles, who was Prince of Wales at the time, to fly the Vulcan. And they gave me a punishment posting after that of 3 years in Cyprus. Came back from there, back to flying instruction, and then the last 4 years as an examiner. In that time of 20 years, I managed to accumulate about 4,000 hours flying the Vulcan. So that's more than enough about me. Let's talk about that wonderful machine that you see in front of you. It came into service as a Vulcan Mark I to carry nuclear weapons in 1956. Slight modification, they added some radar jammers at the back of it, slightly bigger engines, and it became the Mark 1A. That stayed in service, Mark 1 and Mark 1A, until 1970. When I talk about nuclear weapons, I'm talking about things like these. That's yellow sun, and that's blue steel. Yellow sun was in the Bombay itself, and blue steel that you see there was carried by Vulcan as well as Victors, was stuck underneath the aircraft, and the bomb doors were somewhat different. They were concave, and the thing stuck in. Both of these have got 1.1 megaton warheads. And to give you an idea of what that means, about 3 years ago in Beirut in the Lebanon, there was an explosion of 2,700 tons of fertilizer that decided to act as dynamite. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of the damage that it's done. This was 1,100,000 tons. So that's what we carried. So we never used them, fortunately, except for testing in the Pacific. So that's the reason that the aircraft were used, and they were of course called the V-Force, the Valiant, the Victor, and the Vulcan. The Vulcan II, and that's the Vulcan II that you see there, came into service in 1960, and it was really quite different from the Vulcan I. First of all, the wing was bigger. The wingspan was about 12 feet wider, so the wing area was bigger. The wing area actually of the Vulcan was the same as the wing area, more or less, as a B-52, and it was half the weight. So it gives you an idea of the sort of maneuverability and capability that it had. The control surfaces were a bit different. When we get around the back of the aircraft, I'll show you what I mean. The electrical system was alternating current rather than direct current, which was the world standard at the time, direct current. So we changed. We were one of the first aircraft to have alternating current. And there were more integration in the navigation and bombing system. The pilots had integrated instrument panel, and they were the forerunners of effectively the new type, the instruments that you see now on airliners. Of course, they're on flat screens, and we had the real instrument. So there we are. So now, when we look at the aircraft, the first thing that strikes you is that big thing sticking out the front. And that's the flight refueling probe. And if you're plugged into a tanker at, let's say, 30,000, 35,000 feet, you can receive 4,000 pounds of fuel every minute. That's 500 gallons every minute. So it means that in 10 or 15 minutes you can fill your tanks. And that, of course, was used extensively during the Falklands dispute, as you can imagine. Just below it is a little dimple, which is actually a radar head, and it was used to help us fly at low level in bad weather. And it produced a radar beam which was obviously controlled, and if the radar return was less than, I seem to remember, 9,000 feet long, it asked you to fly upward. So the pilot could actually fly that way. But this is all analog stuff, and being analog meant that it wasn't as reliable as the digital stuff we see today. So whenever we flew for practice on using TFR, first the weather had to be good, 5-mile visibility, and the co-pilot, rather than map reading, was just waiting to grab the controls in case things went a bit awry. Right, let's get a bit closer. It's around 6 feet wide, and it is very good. It was designed in the Second World War, but the model we had somewhat had evolved, and it was actually a well-integrated system, but very good. And in the cabin itself, if you have a chance to go in, you'll see a round screen. It's about 9 inches across, but at 40,000 feet with this radar scanner, you could see from top to bottom of that screen something like 400 miles. So it was actually a very, very good system. And it worked well, integrated, and don't forget this is analog stuff, nothing digital at all. Just is a visual bomb aimer's position. All 3V bombers had one of these, but we never used ours. And the reason we didn't use it is because we didn't have the bomb sight that's supposed to fit on there. So instead of that, we mounted a camera pointing downward, which we used at low level during our simulated bomb run. So the camera would be switched on, it would take frames, and at the point of release of the bomb, simulated release of the bomb, we would put a marker on the frame, and then we would be judged on our ability to drop a bomb within 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. When you consider that we're carrying 1.1 megaton, half a mile away wouldn't make that much difference, but we were judged on 50 meters. One of the things we did up until 1969 as aircrew and operational squadrons is that we had to have, each squadron had to have a fully armed aircraft with a crew ready to go at 15-minute readiness. And that really meant what it meant it as well, just in case the Soviet Union decided to do something nasty. So there were 20 squadrons, so you had 20 aircraft ready to go at 15-minute readiness. And when we were on QRA, quick reaction alert, we'd rush into the car. At Scampton, we had the admin buildings and the hangars on one side of the airfield and the aircraft on the other. So we drove like maniacs across the airfield to the aircraft. The aircraft was guarded with an armed guard, as you can imagine. The captain will identify himself to the armed guard. He would then take his key, which was a Morris Minor key, nothing special. He'd unlock the door, we'd rush in, get into our seats, out of breath, close the door, check in with air traffic control, and if it took longer than about 8 or 9 minutes to get to that point, there'd be questions asked. Anyway, we'd sit there waiting for the bomber controller, who was down in High Wycombe in a big hole, to tell us what to do next. And mostly what we did next, because that was Readiness 05, is to go to Readiness 02, starting the engines and taxiing out to the beginning of the runway and waiting there. Now, this exercise, it was called Exercise Edom. This exercise could change into an operation at any time. And if it changed into an operation with the right codes that they sent us and match what the ones we had, then we were going to war. Anyway, it never did. So after that, we were reverted to Readiness 15 and we taxi all the way back into the pan, shut down, middle of the day, no trouble, back to operation, have a coffee. But these exercises happen in the middle of the night as well. So it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you're lying in bed, you're asleep, fully clothed except for your boots. The horn goes, you're off. Put your boots on, into the aircraft, and of course at the end of it, you're back into the pan and you're back into your bed. Now you're full of adrenaline, you're trying to go to sleep, there's no way. You're looking at your watch every 5 minutes because at 7 o'clock the aircrew meal center opens and you want your breakfast. The aircraft carried 37 tons of fuel, spread amongst 14 tanks. There are 4 tanks just above you there, and the rest of the tanks are in the wing. Now, the type of fuel that jet aircraft use is very similar to diesel and also similar to heating oil. Now, the 37 tons, if you wanted to use that for heating your house, would last you 12 years. We used to get rid of it in about 5.5 to 6 hours. Now, the environment was not high priority in the 1950s, 1960s and 70s. So, you know, we use a lot of fuel. Nevertheless, the engines were really cutting edge. They were designed by Bristol Engine before being taken over by Rolls-Royce, and they were called twin spool. Now, let me explain. The jet engine that we had, the type we had, was the air coming in, being compressed into the combustion chambers, lit up, out the back, makes a lot of noise, provides thrust. Now, what the twin spool system did, rather than have a single compressor, which would compress the air at about 6:1 compression ratio, the twin spool compress the first half at 3:1, second half at 3:1, 3 times 3, you get a compression ratio of 9:1 with very little change to the engine. And that allows more energy to be extracted from the fuel. Modern engines have got compression ratios of 40 and 50:1, and there's one in development at 70:1, which means you can extract that much more energy out of the fuel. And they are much more economical than we are. One thing about the Vulcan is that it's a big delta. It was the first big delta that was built in the world, and they had problems at the beginning. It was designed by the same man who designed the Lancaster, a chap by the name of Chadwick, who unfortunately died in an air crash before he could see his aircraft fly. But the original Vulcan had a straight leading edge, so you can imagine a straight line right to the wingtip, and that unfortunately made it unstable. Now, as far as a pilot is concerned, stability means that if you accelerate the aircraft, the nose goes up. But being unstable, the nose went down. And that's bad news, because if you accelerate a bit more, which of course you will do when the nose goes down, the nose goes down a bit further until finally you're going vertically downward. You're not supposed to, and certainly the aircraft wasn't designed to go supersonic, although there was that went supersonic by accident in Cyprus. But that's another story.
And where were you?
I wasn't in it, but I ended up taking it back to the UK. That's what they thought of me at the time. It was bent. So what happened is that they added this bit to the wing, and that bit is a bit special as well, because if you look underneath, it's not convex rather, as all of the other aircraft you see on this side. It's a little bit concave, and that gave it a lot of stability at the sort of speed that we're meant to fly at, which is about 84% of the speed of sound. And indeed we could go on to fly to about 0.92, 0.93, still under control. This was the RAF limit, but the aircraft could actually go up to 0.97 at the speed of sound. Fine interruption. Right, let's get underneath. We were a bomber. We carried bombs, and we carried that big fella at the front there. So the Bombay had to be big. On Bombay itself, the front wall is here, the side wall on this side, and similar on the other side. If I take a short walk, I'll show you the back of it. And that's the back wall. So the whole thing could easily take that big bomb that you saw. But of course, when we had a dispute with the Argentinians in the Falklands, we didn't use one of these big fellas. We used little ones, 1,000-pounders, and we could carry 21 of these in Bombay in 3 racks of 7 each. That was the arrangement that was made. If you think that's a lot, actually, the Victor could carry 35, and of course that meant that when it changed its role to become a tanker, that the whole of the Bombay became a huge fuel tank, which is exactly what was required. Now, another thing about this type of configuration, called a tailless delta, is that it's very high off the ground. And the reason, of course, is because when you come in to land on final approach, the nose is high. And if you had a short undercarriage, then the tail end would drag on the ground. So the undercarriage has to be high. Concorde was even higher, quite a bit higher. And of course the nose was drooped as well, so the pilots could see out. So there are advantages to have this, this height as well. The undercarriage is a bit special too. Now you'll see that there are 8 tires altogether on each wheel. Each one of the wheels have got its own brakes, which is good. But looking at the front to back configuration, it wouldn't fit inside the wheel well. So what happened is that as the undercarriage retracted, the rear set of wheels, the rear bogie, would rotate so that it would nearly line up with the main leg and would then fit inside the wheel well. 1A Vulcan with an ECM pod, and that big bulge at the back is where the ECM, electronic counter, the radar jammers. And they're all like big dustbins, and they're full of valves, little electronic valves, take a lot of power, and they produce a lot of heat. It had its own cooling system. And the ECM in the early 60s was very, very efficient. The American air defense system, NORAD, which included Canada, decided in 1960 to run an exercise which would test their ability to intercept incoming Soviet aircraft. So their own aircraft, the B-52s and the B-47s, were used as Soviet aircraft coming in, and they also invited the RAF to take part. So the RAF, with their brand new Mark II aircraft, decided to send 4 to Bermuda, and those 4 would attack the east coast of the United States on a very broad front, with the jammers, the radar jammers, going full tilt, and not only radar but other frequencies as well, and they were going full power. That took out the whole of the radio and television and radar of the east coast of the United States. One of the aircraft sneaked in undetected completely, landed in Plattsburgh, New York. The other 4 aircraft came in from the UK at 56,000 feet, which was a maximum we could fly at because we were wearing that type of oxygen equipment. But the aircraft itself was able to get above 60,000. So at 56,000 you had 4 aircraft coming in from the UK. 1 was intercepted by accident, and the other 3 got through and could have destroyed, bombed New York, Chicago, and Washington. So when the press release was put out at the end of the exercise by NORAD, they said that 99.99% of all intruders had been intercepted. The truth didn't come out until 1997. Apparently the following year they had a similar exercise with similar results. Slow learners, I don't know. Now, one of the things I mentioned a little earlier was to do with the trailing edge, the flying controls. And the flying controls in the Mark I and the Mark 1A was split. Oh, incidentally, these big black holes that you see there, if you've been to an air display where the Vulcan was displaying, that's where the noise came from. So the control surfaces, you had 2 here, the size of barn doors. In the Vulcan Mark I and 1A, they controlled the elevators, and the outer two that you could see fully up on the other side controlled the aileron. But in the Mark II, the whole of the trailing edge was a single unit through a mixer unit that actually allowed, if you pull the stick fully back, all the control surfaces went up. One side went up one side, down on the other. It gave you a huge amount of controllability and flexibility as well. At 40,000 feet, for example, there wasn't a fighter that could follow us. We would outturn them, except for the Scimitar and the Sea Vixen, and they didn't count because they were Royal Navy anyway. So at low level it was the same, very, very flexible. Now, if you've seen a Vulcan display, you realize how good it was. You know, it acted like a fighter with steep turns and what have you. During the 1960s and 70s, Strategic Air Command of the USAF were running bombing and navigation competitions, and the RAF was always invited, except during the Vietnam period, the RAF was always invited to take part. And we did well over the years. We won all of the trophies at one time or another. But in 1978, I think it was, SAC, Strategic Air Command, decided to put in an extra hoop. And this was an interception by their fighters, F-102 Delta Darts, I think they were, by their fighters at low level during a simulated bomb run. And because they didn't have the radar response of the Vulcan, neither for the ground radar nor their airborne radar, they asked me to take one down to northern Florida, fly around, and so they could have a good look at what the response was like on their radar, and then also show them what our evasive maneuver was. Now, we had a rearward looking radar. That thing in the back there looks back at high altitude, about 15 miles. It could pick up an aircraft. At low altitude, because of ground return, probably about 5 or 6 miles. So we're flying along at 300 feet, standard height, 350 knots, standard speed, when the AEO, who's controlling the rearward looking radar, calls, "We've got a contact at about 5 miles closing in on us." As soon as he said that, we closed the throttle, put the air brakes out to maximum, slowed down to 190 knots. At that point, cranked 60 degrees of bank. Now, fighters at that speed and altitude and angle of bank fall out of the sky. There's no way they're going to follow us. And even the missiles, that the ground radar could simulate the missile leaving the fighter to the target. Even the missile couldn't follow us. That's got some limits as well. So when we landed on the debrief, the SAC people said, "You'll have to limit yourself to a minimum of 250 knots and 45 degrees of bank," which made the aircraft a bit of a sitting duck. Anyway, we passed that on to the crews who were taking part, and the competition duly took place, and we did very well in the bombing competition. And when they came back, I went to see the captain of the crew, and I said, "Well done," you know, etc., etc. What about this limit? We intercepted at low level. He said, "Oh yes, yeah, all of the attacks were intercepted." So what about this limit of 250 knots and 45 degrees of bank? He said, "No, we just ignored that." It's one way to get it going. Right, one more thing I'd like to point out, probably more visible from the side here, is that little bulge at the base of the rudder. It houses a tail brake parachute, which was 45 feet in diameter and produced an enormous amount of retardation. In fact, you could use that to slow all the way down to taxi speed. Unfortunately, if we let the system go at that sort of speed, the big buckle inside would jam around all over the place, the compartment, damage the compartment. So we normally let it go at 80 knots. In 1981, or I think 82, the RAF was disposing of the Vulcans. And the RAF Fire School at Catterick wanted the Vulcan so they could set fire to it and put it out again, I suppose. And they asked me to take one to Catterick. Now, we operated normally from 9,000 foot long runways. We could operate 7,500 foot long runways without problem. and 6,000 foot was a little bit of a tight squeeze. The Catterick runway is 3,000 feet long. And worse than that, it abuts directly onto the A1. Not the modern A1, but the old one. So they advised the press, television, radio, what have you, to come and have a look at this aircraft that's going to crash onto the A1. So they were all there. Police stopped the traffic on the A1. We landed right at the beginning of the runway. As soon as we were down, we popped the chute. As soon as we felt the retardation, we jammed on the anchors. We stopped in 1,500 feet.
This weekend is a
So there's a press at the end of the runway. We could see them all there waiting for us to crash or at least leave the refueling probe over the top. But both of us in the front looked at each other and said, what do we do? Do we taxi up to them? No, you've guessed it. We didn't. They had to walk. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me and my little stories. One thing I'd like to point out, there are some books available. One of them is called Flying the Vulcan, and another one which is written by me called 20 Years on Vulcans. They're available in the shop. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.